He dumped his low-class girlfriend in the freezing slush to marry a CEO's daughter, never realizing the man stepping out of the obsidian-black Rolls-Royce Cullinan was the king of Seoul, and the father she had been running from. The snow fell like shards of glass in Seoul that night. The city lights flickered against the cold steel of the skyscrapers, but on the pavement, the air was a death sentence. Ryu Solin stood there, life-tired, her spirit as damp and frayed as the worn brown jacket clinging to her shivering frame. She had spent months working 3 soul-crushing jobs just to prove she could survive without her family's blood-soaked legacy. Her boyfriend didn't even look back. He adjusted his silk tie, sneered at her pathetic poverty, and told her she was a stain on his upwardly mobile future before walking away into the golden warmth of the gala. Solin tried to scream, but the frost had already stolen her breath. She made it 3 steps before her legs buckled. She collapsed onto the icy pavement, her breath coming out in weak, broken clouds as the world began to fade to gray. Her ex watched her fall from behind the glass and simply turned away. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly survive knowing, was that a phantom quiet Rolls-Royce had just drifted to the curb. The man stepping out, his leather-gloved hands trembling with a rage that could burn the city to the ground, was Ryu Taevrin, the most feared Mafia boss in Korea. And that the disposable girl dying in the snow was the only thing in this world he ever truly loved. Before we reveal the moment the ex-boyfriend realizes he just threw away his life, if you love stories of absolute power, billionaire revenge, and the bond between a dangerous father and his daughter, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens when the King of Seoul finds out who hurt his princess. The heavy silence of the Ryu estate was a weight Solin hadn't felt in 3 years, but as she drifted toward consciousness, it pressed against her chest like lead. She didn't wake up to the sound of sirens or the whistling wind of her damp apartment. Instead, she woke to the scent of sandalwood and expensive linen. Her eyes fluttered open, stinging from the cold she had endured. Above her was a ceiling of hand-painted silk, illuminated by the soft, ambient glow of a recessed fireplace. For a terrifying second, she thought she was dead. Then, the door clicked. Ryu Taevrin stepped into the room, his presence instantly shrinking the cavernous suite. He had shed his heavy coat and leather gloves, appearing in a charcoal turtleneck that made his sharp features look even more lethal. In his hand was a porcelain bowl of warm broth, the steam rising in delicate curls. Solin tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed in protest. "Don't," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that brooked no argument. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress barely dipping under his weight. "Where am I?" she whispered, her throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "You're home, Solin," he said, his eyes scanning her face with a mixture of raw relief and simmering fury. "In the only place where no one can touch you." "I told you I was never coming back here," she rasped, the memory of her vow, made the night she fled his blood-stained world, flashing behind her eyes. "I don't want your money, father. I don't want any of this." Taevrin's jaw tightened. He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint blue bruise on her temple where she had hit the ice. "And yet, the world you chose instead let you starve. It let a man with the soul of a cockroach discard you like trash in a blizzard." He leaned closer, his shadow engulfing her. "You tried to be low-class, Solin. You tried to be invisible. But you forgot one thing, you are a Ryu. You were born in the sun, and you cannot survive in the gutter." Solin looked away, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. She had fought so hard to be independent, to be more than just the daughter of a monster. But as she felt the warmth of the room and the safety of the reinforced walls, a shameful part of her felt the fear receding. "He'll come looking for me," she said, thinking of her ex-boyfriend. Taevrin's expression shifted into something terrifyingly calm, the look he wore before an execution. "Let him. I've already wiped his name from every ledger in this city. By tomorrow, he will realize that when he threw you away, he threw away the only thing keeping him alive." He held the spoon to her lips, a silent peace offering from a man who had never asked for anything in his life. Soline hesitated, then took it. The hiding was over. The princess had been reclaimed, and the city was about to burn for the way it had treated her. The heavy silence of the Ryu estate was a sanctuary for some, but for Soline, it felt like a museum where she was the newest exhibit. After Tavrin left the room, the stillness returned, punctuated only by the rhythmic crackle of the cedar logs in the fireplace. She pushed back the silk duvet, her feet sinking into a rug so plush it felt like stepping into a cloud. Everything in the room was designed to soothe: the muted cream walls, the soft glow of moonlight through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the sheer absence of the city's roar. She wandered toward the massive walk-in closet, her fingers trembling as she slid open the frosted glass doors. Inside, a row of garments hung in a perfect gradient of color. There were no worn brown jackets here. Instead, she found rows of cashmere overcoats, silk blouses, and tailored wool trousers, all in her exact size. Her father had never stopped expecting her return. He had been buying her life in installments while she was out in the world trying to throw it away. As she touched a sleeve of charcoal velvet, a soft chime echoed through the suite. A voice, polite and detached, spoke through a hidden intercom. "Miss Soline, the master has cleared the east wing. There is no one in the corridors." Soline froze. She remembered how much she had loathed the constant observation of the Ryu household guards, the shadows, who watched her every move. Tavrin had clearly remembered too. To give her a sense of peace, he had effectively emptied half his mansion, banishing his army of black-suited men to the perimeter just so she wouldn't feel hunted in her own home. She stepped out into the hallway, her movements cautious. The corridor was a gallery of her father's power. Ancient Josian-era vases stood beside modern abstract paintings that likely cost more than the apartment building she had just been evicted from. She made her way toward the grand balcony overlooking the private gardens. The garden was a frozen masterpiece. The trees were draped in fairy lights that glowed like fallen stars against the fresh snow. From this height, the city of Seoul looked like a toy set, its harshness muffled by distance. She leaned against the cold stone railing, the biting air finally feeling like a choice rather than a punishment. "It's too cold for you to be out here," a voice murmured from the shadows of the doorway. Soline didn't jump. She knew that voice. Tavrin remained in the dimness of the threshold, respecting the boundaries she had subconsciously drawn by stepping outside. He didn't want to be another shadow she feared. "You sent everyone away," she said, her back still turned to him. "The guards. The maids. Why?" "Because you were always a bird that bruised its wings against the bars," Tavrin replied, his voice carrying a rare, raw edge of honesty. "I cannot change who I am, Soline. I cannot stop being the man the city fears. But in this house, I can make the shadows retreat if it means you'll stay." Soline turned to look at him. In the half-light, the terrifying King of Seoul looked weary. The silken shadows of the estate were his armor, but as he looked at his daughter, the armor seemed to weigh him down. "I'm not that girl anymore, father," she said softly. "The one who cried because there were too many eyes on her." "I know," he said, stepping forward just enough for the light to hit his face. "That girl didn't survive the winter. The woman who did, she's the one I need to get to know." He held out a hand, not to grab her, but as an invitation to come back into the warmth. Soline looked at his hand, then out at the glittering, cruel city below. The world of poverty had tried to break her, but the world of shadows was waiting to reclaim her. She took a step toward him, leaving the cold behind, as the doors hissed shut, sealing them into their private world of silk and secrets. The following morning, the snow had stopped, leaving Seoul draped in a deceptive, sparkling white. Soline sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce, her frame enveloped in a coat of cream-colored wool that felt heavier than her old life combined. Tavrin sat beside her, silent, his attention seemingly fixed on a tablet, though she could feel his perimeter-less focus on her every breath. "I need my things," she had told him. She didn't want the clothes, but she wanted the closure. She needed to stand in the place where she had been discarded one last time, to prove to herself that the cold couldn't kill her. Tavrin had simply nodded. Now, the car glided to a halt in front of the glass-faced office building where she had spent her last year in a cubicle. As the chauffeur opened her door, the crisp air hit her, but it didn't bite. The heat from the luxury interior and the quality of her new armor kept the world at bay. She didn't get 5 steps toward the entrance before a familiar, sharp voice cut through the quiet of the plaza. "Soline? What on earth are you doing here?" She turned slowly. Standing near the fountain was Min-ho, her ex-boyfriend. He looked impeccable in a charcoal overcoat, his arm linked firmly with a woman draped in designer logos, the CEO's daughter he had traded Soline for. Min-ho's eyes raked over Soline, pausing on the Rolls-Royce idling at the curb. A sneer curled his lip, his expression shifting from surprise to a cruel, familiar condescension. "I see you didn't waste any time. Who is he, Soline? Some old man willing to pay for a low-class girl to play dress-up for a week?" The woman beside him giggled, a hollow, tinkling sound. "Is this the one you told me about, darling? The one who lived in the damp basement?" Soline felt the old sting of shame for a split second, the phantom weight of the blizzard returning to her chest. But then, she looked past Min-ho's shoulder. The door of the Rolls-Royce opened again. Ryu Tavrin stepped out. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, predatory grace of a man who owned the air everyone else breathed. The atmosphere in the plaza changed instantly. The security guards at the glass doors straightened their backs, and the passing pedestrians instinctively veered away. Min-ho's sneer faltered. He recognized the face. Everyone in the upper echelons of Seoul knew the face of the man who controlled the docks, the banks, and the shadows. Min-ho's face went from pale to a sickly, ashen gray. "And Mr. Ryu?" Min-ho stammered, his arm dropping from his fiancée's side as if he'd been electrocuted. I didn't realize you were in this district. I'm a junior partner at..." Tavrin ignored him completely, walking straight to Soline. He reached out, adjusting the collar of her coat with a gentleness that was more terrifying than a shout. "Is this the creature, Soline?" Tavrin asked, his voice a smooth, lethal silk. He didn't even look at Min-ho, treating him like a smudge of dirt on an otherwise clean sidewalk. "He was the one," Soline said, her voice steady and clear for the first time in years. Min-ho's knees visibly trembled. "Soline. I didn't, we were just... I was coming to find you." Tavrin finally turned his gaze toward Min-ho. It was the look of a god deciding where to strike the first bolt of lightning. "You spoke to my daughter about class?" Tavrin asked softly. "You looked at a Ryu and saw someone disposable?" The woman beside Min-ho backed away, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the air. "I'll give you 10 seconds to vanish from her sight," Tavrin whispered. "And then I'll spend the rest of the afternoon making sure that by sunset, no one in this country remembers your name." Min-ho didn't wait for 5. He turned and stumbled, nearly falling over his own feet as he fled toward the safety of the glass building, a building Tavrin already owned the mortgage on. Soline watched him go, realizing that the man she had loved wasn't a giant, he was a terrified insect. She looked at her father, seeing the monster he was, but also the shield he provided. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. She simply turned back toward the car, the silk of her sleeves whispering against the shadows of her past. The following afternoon, the sun offered no warmth, only a harsh glare that bounced off the pristine white grounds of the Ryu estate. Inside Tavrin's private study, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the cold, metallic tang of high-end security tech. Soline sat in a leather armchair that felt far too large for her, watching as her father manipulated a holographic display on his desk. "You spent 3 years trying to bury your identity, Soline," Tavrin said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual melodic silk. "But while you were trying to forget who you were, the rest of the world was keeping track." He flicked his wrist, and a series of high-resolution photographs expanded in the air between them. Soline's breath hitched. They weren't family portraits. They were surveillance shots. There she was, 6 months ago, huddled under a bus stop awning in the rain. There she was, 3 months ago, counting coins at a convenience store counter. And there, most chillingly, was a photo of her through her apartment window, sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor. My enemies didn't see a girl trying to find herself, Tavrin continued, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers. They saw a vulnerability. They saw a way to make the King of Soul bleed. Soline looked at the images, a cold shiver crawling down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter outside. You had people following me? This whole time? Not just my people, Tavrin said, his jaw tightening. He swiped to a final set of photos. These were grainy, taken from a distance. They showed a black van parked outside her workplace, the same one she had seen at the gala. Park Sung-ho's men were documenting your every move. They were waiting for the moment I broke, or the moment you became desperate enough to be used as leverage. He stood up and walked toward her, the light from the display casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He held out a heavy signet ring, the Ryu family crest, a dragon coiled around a sword. This is the weight of the name you carry, he whispered. You thought that by leaving, you were choosing freedom. But in our world, Soline, there is no such thing as being nobody. You are either the person holding the blade, or the person the blade is pointed at. Soline looked from the ring to the photos of her former, fragile life. She realized then that her independence had been a delusion. She hadn't been free, she had been a target walking in the dark. The name Ryu wasn't just a legacy of blood, it was the only armor that actually worked. I didn't want the throne, she said, her voice trembling but certain. I know, Tavrin replied, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. But the throne has already claimed you. Now, you have to decide if you're going to sit on it, or let them bury you under it. The car ride back to the estate was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the previous night. It was the quiet of a storm front moving in, cool, electric, and inevitable. Tavrin didn't look at Soline, he was focused on his phone, his thumb moving with a rhythmic, clinical precision that made Soline realize he wasn't just sending messages. He was moving pieces on a board she couldn't see. You don't have to do this, Soline said softly, watching the blurred neon of Soul whip past the tinted window. He's a nobody. He isn't worth the effort of your anger. Tavrin didn't look up from the screen. Effort implies a struggle, Soline. Crushing a gnat requires no effort. It only requires a decision. He paused, finally locking his dark, obsidian eyes onto hers. He didn't just insult a girl. He insulted a Ryu. He looked at my legacy and thought it was something he could trample in the slush. If I let that stand, I am not the man this city thinks I am. By the time they reached the estate, the first strike had already landed, though the world wouldn't feel the tremors until morning. Tavrin led her into his private study, a room filled with the scent of old leather and cold ink. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, preferring the amber glow of a single desk lamp. On the monitor, a series of scrolling red numbers told the story of a massacre. Look, he commanded gently. Soline leaned in. She recognized the logo of the firm Minho worked for, the one he had bragged about being indispensable to. The stock price was in freefall, a jagged cliff of red. I didn't just fire him, Tavrin explained, his voice devoid of heat. I pulled every Ryu-affiliated investment from that firm. I contacted the CEO, the father of the woman he was so eager to marry. I informed him that his future son-in-law had a history of poor judgment regarding family alliances. By noon, the engagement was dissolved. By 1, his bank accounts were frozen pending an internal audit I personally requested. And by 2, he was escorted from the building by security. Soline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. He's lost everything. Not yet, Tavrin corrected. He stood up, walking to the window to look out over the city he ruled. He still has his pride. He still has the clothes on his back. That is far more than he left you with last night. He turned back to her, the light catching the sharp, predatory line of his jaw. This isn't just about him, Soline. It's a signal to everyone who watched you fall in that plaza. They need to know that the girl in the worn brown jacket is dead. In her place is someone who can dismantle a life with a single phone call. Soline looked at the screen, at the digital ruin of the man who had broken her heart. She expected to feel a surge of triumph, but instead, she felt a strange, hollow vertigo. She was back in the world of shadows, where power was the only currency that mattered. Is this how it's going to be? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Every time someone crosses me, you burn their world down? Tavrin walked over to her, his leather-gloved hand coming up to rest almost tenderly on her shoulder. It was a heavy, grounding weight. No, Soline, he whispered. Eventually, you won't need me to do it. Eventually, you'll learn to strike the match yourself. He left her alone in the dim room with the red numbers. Outside, the wind began to howl again, but inside the Ryu fortress, the temperature was perfect, a controlled, artificial warmth that felt more like a cage than she wanted to admit. The first strike was over, and for the first time, Soline realized that once the blood starts to spill, it never quite knows how to stop. The following afternoon, the sky over Seoul performed a rare, bruised miracle. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the heavy gray clouds fractured, filtering the light into a surreal palette of soft pinks and deep, aching purples. It was a pink-purple winter, a fleeting moment where the city looked less like a concrete jungle and more like a dream captured in glass. Tavrin found Soline standing on the edge of the estate's frozen lake. She wasn't wearing the heavy, protective cashmere he had bought her. Instead, she had draped a simple lavender shawl over her shoulders, her curly hair catching the strange, iridescent light. She looked like a ghost of the girl she used to be, hovering between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The air is turning, Tavrin said, his footsteps crunching softly on the crystalline snow. He didn't approach her directly, stopping several feet away to give her the space he knew she craved. In this light, everything looks soft. It's a lie, of course. The ice is just as thin. Soline didn't turn around. She was watching a pair of swans huddled near a patch of dark, unfrozen water. Why did you really come for me, father? You could have let me stay in that plaza. You could have let the snow take me, and your legacy would have been safe from my complications. Tavrin was silent for a long time. The pink light caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the terrifying mask he wore for the world. I spent 3 years pretending I was glad you were gone, he whispered, the admission sounding like it cost him blood. I told myself the Ryu name was stronger without a daughter who hated the very soil it grew from. But then I saw the reports. I saw you working in that damp coat, eating bread from a convenience store. And I realized that the only thing more painful than your hatred was your absence. He finally stepped closer, his presence warm against the biting chill. I didn't come for the legacy, Soline. I came because when I looked at the surveillance photos of you in the rain, I didn't see a rebel. I saw the little girl who used to hide in my study because she was afraid of the dark. And I realized I had become the very darkness you were hiding from. Soline turned then, her eyes shimmering with the reflected purple of the sky. For the first time since her return, she didn't look at him with defiance. She looked at him with a profound, quiet sadness. You destroyed Minho's life in an afternoon. You can change the weather of this city with a phone call. How am I supposed to live in a world where everything is a casualty of your love? You live by realizing that my love is the only thing in this city that isn't for sale, Tavrin replied. He reached out, his bare hand, cold but steady, carefully tucking a stray curl behind her ear. I cannot be a good man, Soline. The winter doesn't apologize for being cold. But I can be your father. I can be the wall between you and the wind. The sky began to deepen into a violent violet, the pink fading like a bruised memory. The pink-purple winter was ending, giving way to the true, unforgiving night. Solene leaned into his touch, just for a second, her forehead resting against his chest. It wasn't a total surrender, but it was a truce. The light is gone, she murmured against the dark wool of his coat. The light is always temporary, Tavrin said, his arm finally coming around her to pull her back toward the glowing warmth of the mansion. But the shadows stay. And in the shadows, you are finally safe. As they walked back, the first few flakes of a new storm began to fall, landing on the purple snow like ashes. The truce was signed in the fading light, but both of them knew that the real war, the one involving the rival families who had noted Solene's return, was only just beginning to stir in the dark. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, vibrating with the superficial hum of Seoul's elite. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light onto women in silk and men in power suits, all gathered to celebrate the engagement of the year, Minho and the CEO's daughter. Minho stood at the center of a circle of admirers, his smile tight, his eyes darting toward the entrance. He had spent the last 48 hours watching his world crumble, his bank accounts flagged, his reputation whispering away, but he believed this party, this alliance, would be his salvation. He believed he was still safe because he hadn't seen the shadow of the king. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. The room didn't just go quiet, it went cold. The air seemed to be sucked out of the space as Ryu Solene stepped into the light. She was no longer the girl in the worn brown jacket with snow in her hair. She was a vision of lethal elegance, draped in a floor-length gown of midnight velvet that shimmered like oil on water. Around her neck sat a collar of diamonds so heavy they looked like armor, each stone a testament to the Ryu family's terrifying wealth. Beside her, Tavrin moved like a silent storm. He didn't wear a tuxedo, he wore a sharp, black military-style coat over his shoulders, his presence turning the gala into a court. He didn't look at the guests, he looked only at the path ahead, his hand resting lightly on Solene's lower back, guiding her with the possessive grace of a man reclaiming his throne. Minho's glass hit the marble floor. The sound of shattering crystal echoed like a gunshot. He stared at Solene, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The low-class girl he had dumped in the slush was standing before him, radiating a power that made his own social climbing look like a child playing in the dirt. Solene walked straight toward him, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. She stopped inches from him, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the metallic tang of his fear. She looked at his fiancée, who was clutching Minho's arm with trembling fingers. "A lovely party," Solene said, her voice a cool, melodic chime that carried to every corner of the room. "But I believe you're wearing something that belongs to me." Minho swallowed hard, his face a mask of sweating terror. "Solene, please. I didn't know. I swear, if I had known who your father was." "That's the problem, Minho," she interrupted, her eyes as hard as the diamonds at her throat. "You didn't think I was worth anything because of who I was. You only think I'm worth something now because of who he is." She stepped closer, leaning in as if to share a secret. "My father wanted to burn this building down with you inside it. I told him no. I wanted to see your face when you realized that the girl you threw away was the only thing that could have saved you from him." Tavrin stepped forward then, his obsidian eyes locking onto Minho. He didn't raise a hand, but the sheer weight of his intent made the younger man stumble backward. "The engagement is over," Tavrin whispered, loud enough for the CEO standing nearby to hear. "Your firm is already being liquidated. By tomorrow, you won't even have a name to introduce yourself with." Solene reached out and plucked a champagne flute from a passing tray. She didn't drink. Instead, she let it tilt, the golden liquid spilling over Minho's expensive shoes, mirroring the way the snow had melted off her boots just 2 nights ago. "Class isn't something you marry into, Minho," she said softly. "It's something you're born with. And clearly, you were born with nothing." She turned on her heel, her velvet train sweeping the spilled wine. She didn't look back to see him collapse. She walked out of the ballroom with her head held high, the King of Soul at her side, leaving the elite to whisper about the princess they had nearly forgotten. The confrontation was over, but as the cool night air hit her face outside, she saw a line of black vans idling at the curb, not her father's. The gilded world was about to shatter, and the diamonds around her neck felt suddenly, chillingly heavy. The transition from the warmth of the gala to the underground parking garage was a descent into a different kind of silence. The click of Soline's heels against the concrete echoed like a ticking clock. Tavrin moved beside her, his hand never leaving the small of her back, his eyes scanning the concrete pillars with a rhythmic, mechanical intensity. He knew the world of silk was over, the world of lead had arrived. The vans, Soline whispered, nodding toward the idling vehicles she had seen from the entrance. I know, Tavrin replied, his voice a low, vibrating hum. Stay behind me. Do not look away. They were 10 feet from the Rolls-Royce when the first shard of glass exploded. A high-caliber round shattered the window of a nearby luxury SUV, the sound blooming in the enclosed space like a thunderclap. Soline didn't scream. The years of living on the edge had hardened her reflexes, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tavrin didn't hesitate. He spun, his heavy wool coat flaring out like a dark wing as he shoved Soline into the narrow gap between their car and the concrete wall. Down! Another shot rang out, then a rhythmic stutter of automatic fire. The windshield of the Rolls-Royce spiderwebbed into 1,000 glittering diamonds, rain falling over the pavement. From the shadows of the pillars, 3 figures emerged, their faces obscured by tactical masks. These weren't the petty socialites of the ballroom, these were professionals sent by Park Sung-ho. Tavrin pulled a sleek, matte black handgun from his shoulder holster with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold. He didn't hide. He stepped into the line of fire, his movements calm, almost bored. He fired 3 times. The precision was surgical. 2 of the figures dropped without a sound, their momentum cut short by the absolute finality of his aim. Soline, move to the driver's side, he commanded, firing again to pin down the 3rd shooter. She scrambled through the glass, the shards slicing into the palms of her hands, but she didn't feel the pain. She reached the door just as a grenade of pressurized gas hissed across the floor, filling the air with a choking, white haze. Through the fog, she saw a shadow lunging toward her father. Father, she cried out. Tavrin didn't turn, he ducked a swinging blade and caught the assassin by the throat, the sound of breaking bone muffled by the hiss of the gas. He threw the body aside like a piece of refuse and lunged into the car beside her. Drive, he roared, his eyes wild with a protective rage she had never seen. As the car roared to life, tires screaming against the concrete, Soline looked in the rearview mirror. The King of Soul was covered in the dust of broken glass, his knuckles bleeding, his empire under siege. For the first time, she realized that the diamonds around her neck weren't just a gift, they were a target. The glass had shattered, and the true winter was just beginning. The safe house was nestled high in the mountains, a fortress of cedar and stone that looked out over a soul draped in a quiet, melting white. The violence of the parking garage felt like a fever dream, but the dried blood on Soline's palms and the way Tavrin stared into the fireplace told her the world had changed. The attempt on her life had been the final catalyst. For years, Tavrin had ruled through fear and shadows, but as he watched Soline sleep fitfully on the sofa, he realized that a throne built on corpses was no place for his daughter to live. He didn't make a phone call this time. He didn't move pieces on a board. He sat beside her, his presence no longer a looming shadow, but a weary, human weight. It's over, Soline, he whispered as her eyes fluttered open. Park Sung-ho is gone. Not because I killed him, but because I gave him what he wanted. I've liquidated the syndicate's holdings. The docks, the backroom banks, the debt, it's all being absorbed into a legitimate trust. Soline sat up, the lavender shawl slipping from her shoulders. You're giving it up? Your power? I'm choosing a different kind of power, Tavrin said, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. I spent my life building a wall of ice to keep the world out, only to realize I'd frozen you out, too. The Ryu name won't be feared in the streets anymore. It will be built on the companies I've turned toward the light. I want to build something you don't have to run from. Solene looked at his hands, the hands that had rescued her from the snow, the hands that had fired a gun to protect her. She reached out and took them, lacing her fingers through his. The ice between them had finally, completely, shattered. I spent so long trying to prove I wasn't your daughter, she said softly. But I realize now that I don't have to be your shadow. I can be your partner. They stood together on the balcony as the first light of dawn hit the peaks. The snow was retreating, giving way to the stubborn green of the pines. Below them, the city was waking up, a city that no longer belonged to a mafia boss, but to a father and a daughter ready to redefine their legacy. Tavrin wrapped his arm around her, and this time, Solene didn't pull away. She leaned into the warmth, watching the sun rise over a future that was no longer a gilded cage, but a wide, bright, and open road. The winter was over. The legacy was reborn, built not on blood, but on the quiet, impossible survival of a love that refused to freeze.